Let's now address the factors that contribute to increasing the robustness and stability of food webs. Here we have on the left a quite simple food webs, a food web that has the same number of species but less links as the food web on the right. Let's imagine that the species with the blue dots is going to get extinct. This is, as we learn, a primary extinction. Then what is going to happen is that the three predators linked to this species are going to get secondary extinct, and so on. Through the food web, we have a cascade of extinction. Instead, with increasing the complexity of the food web, which is in this case increasing the number of interactions among the species, we can see how the robustness of the food web increase by decreasing the number of secondary extinctions. Indeed, even though this same species is going to get extinct, it is not going to produce any secondary extinction. Indeed, the three predators that are linked to it are feeding also on other prey. These ways, the cascading effects of this primary extinction are going to be damped, are going to be absorbed through the food webs thanks to this higher density of interaction. This has been demonstrated also in empirical food web. Here we can see that food web structure displays increasing robustness to loss of either random or highly connected species with increasing the complexity. Again, here measured as connectance. We are familiar already with this type of plot. We have on the x-axis the complexity, on the y-axis the robustness. In particular, we can see that with connectance, in this case, again, a measure of interaction richness, of how diverse are the interactions, we can see that connectance delays the point at which food webs display high sensitivity to removals of the most highly connected species. Low connectance instead displays also some sensitivity from the outset. Intermediate connectance webs have a threshold of roughly 20 to 30% removal before the onset to extreme sensitivity. Instead, high connectance web have a much higher threshold, roughly around 40%, before reaching the onset of sensitivity. We can then generalize from this that the structurally stabilizing role of increasing connectance is apparent as the magnitude of secondary extinction decrease with increasing connectance. And this is associated to the onset of higher rates of secondary extinctions with increasing connectance that become delayed. The species eventually go extinct, but at a much further stage. Let's examine here an empirical example. In this very important study by Sanders and colleagues, it was carried out an experimental manipulation with a food web. This is a case with a terrestrial food web composed of plants and herbivores and parasitoids and hyperparasitoids. The authors of this study experimentally assembled these food webs, these communities, and also performed experimentally the removal, what we learn, the local extirpation, or as we call in food webs, the primary extinctions. These species primary extinct are indicated by arrows. We have on the x-axis the time, the weeks after the experiment was set up, after the precisely after week number 6, the removal of the parasitoids, and on the y-axis we have robustness measured as fraction of species persisting. We have with circles a simple community as indicated on top of the food webs, where the interactions among species are much more simplified. We can see that the majority of parasitoids have only one interacting patterns. Instead, in the second food webs, there are at least few species with more than one interaction. This kind of diversifying interactions is called trophic redundancy, which is analogous to the redundancy of species. These known biodiversity effects, which are positive for the functioning of ecosystems, are somehow similar to the redundancy of interactions. So, with harvesting the food web, which is with removing the species, it is clear to see how the differences in robustness are significant between the simple and the complex community. Let's focus on the white dots and the empty rhomboids. We can see that the robustness, the persistence of the food web and its population is significantly lower in simple communities than in complex ones. This indicates then this trophic redundancy, the fact that species have more than one interaction types, and these are replicated. There are copies, there are different types of these interactions, confers stability to the entire food web. We can now focus on another type of factor that contributes to increasing food web persistence and stability. In this case, we are going to focus on a mesoscale property of food webs, which are the network motifs. The author here, Stoffer and Bascomte, analyzed 4 types of common network motifs that are characterizing empirical real-world food webs. Those 4 are the tree trophic chain, the trophic cascade, the omnivory, exploitative competition, and apparent competition. Then authors ran 2 types of dynamic simulation. In the first case, as indicated in panel B, they ran a dynamic for the food web, including only the 3 motifs in isolation. Instead, then they continue by looking at the entire food web dynamics characterized by those motifs. Let's focus on the dynamic and stability of networks motifs in isolation. In panel B, we have on the x-axis time, which represents the increase in primary extinctions, and on the y-axis, the robustness of the food web. We can see that tree trophic chain motif, which resemble trophic cascades, shows the higher stability. This is followed by exploitative competition, omnivory, and apparent competition. So this indicates that this pervasive motif, which is the tree trophic chain and the food chain more generally, they have a very important role in the food webs, which is basically increasing the food web persistence. And in this particular case, they increase and stabilize the single population of each species involved in this network motif. When then authors look at the stability of the entire network of the food web overall as composed by those building blocks, by these aggregating these network motifs, results were surprisingly quite different. Indeed, we have that the persistence of the food webs was significantly higher than zero in the case of trophic chain and omnivory, while it was significantly lower than zero in exploitative competition and apparent competition. These results then indicate that trophic chain and omnivory have a stabilizing role for the entire food web when looking at this the role of these motifs in the entire food web. Instead, for motifs of exploitative and apparent competition, even though they had a positive role in isolation, this was not translated when looking at the whole food web persistence. Now we can switch our attention to an important property, a macro scale structure characterizing food webs, named modularity. We may recall that modularity is the degree to which species are organized in this dense compartment. And we can look how modularity affects food robustness. In panel A, we have modular web made up of 3 compartments with these 3 different colors. Let's hypothesize that the species highlighted in red and indicated by this arrow goes extinct. This is our primary extinction. In case of panel B, in case of a positive effect of compartmentalization, following the primary extinction of the species in red, it is possible and reasonable to hypothesize that modularity will restrict the effects of the perturbation only to those species within the species compartment, instead to let the effects of primary extinction propagating and cascading to other compartments. Then we would expect that secondary extinctions are more probable within the same compartment of the primary extinct species. So in this way, the extinction cascade will not propagate throughout the entire food web. In panel C, instead, if we hypothesize no effects of modularity, then we would expect that the effects of primary extinction of the species in red will cascade through the food web and will cause secondary extinctions for species also belonging to other compartments. Here we have the results of a dynamic simulation indicating the propagation of the extinctions within the food webs. Authors also manipulate in their model the complexity of the food web, here indicated on the x-axis as connectance. Results indicate that as connectance of the food web increases, the tendency to observe consecutive extinction of directly connected species decrease. These are indicated, as we can see, in the white triangle in panel A. Instead, for species within the same compartment, the same increase in network connectance increases the extinction of other species, as indicated with red circles. Let's focus now on panel B, and we can see that in this case within compartment extinctions when separated between directly connected species, as in gray square, and non-directly connected species, we see that the probability of secondary extinctions between two non-directly connected species increase with increasing the connectance. Instead, on the other hand, it does not change with directly connected species. In summary, this shows that the hypothesized role of modularity for decreasing the propagation of food webs it's a reasonable hypothesis, and this suggests that the pervasive presence of this structure may be a result of this important function for the stability of the food web. Finally, we can look at how an important component of food webs, namely body mass, and particularly the ratio between predator and prey body mass, can impact food web stability. Here, model simulations demonstrate that indeed increasing predator-prey body mass ratio increases the food web stability. Here measured as the persistence of populations. This is possible because food webs may gain stability by increasing their intrinsic and changing their intrinsic body mass structure, and in particular the ratio between predator and prey. A possible explanation for this observed pattern is that increasing the ratio of body mass between predator and prey decrease the relative predation rate and the consumption of prey. So this supports the higher density of prey populations, because predators they need to prey less. And this is quantified by the interaction strength and the consumption rates based on body mass, which decrease with increasing the predator-prey body mass ratio. In summary, the factors that enhance the robustness of food webs and in general the persistence of species and the stability of communities are indicated by different properties. If we focus at the species level, we have that the density of the interactions, likewise the richness of species, and in particularly the proportion between these two, what we call connectance, the famous measure of food web complexity, increases significantly the stability and especially the robustness of food webs. This is also accompanied by a redundancy of functions, the redundancy of trophic interactions, which also contribute to increase food web robustness. We have also seen that particular network motifs based on trophic cascades, such as trophic chains and omnivory, have a very important role in increasing food web robustness, both locally at the species motif level as well as globally for the entire food web. Considering instead a macro scale structure such as modularity, we have seen that increasing the modularity significantly increase food web stability and robustness, thanks to the role that modules have in limiting the propagation of primary extinction. In this way, in case of losing a species, these cascading effects won't propagate through the food web but will remain only within certain compartments. Finally, we've seen how an important ecological law, which is the allometric scaling, the rules that govern flows of matter and energy and the metabolism, have a very important role in food web stability and particularly population persistence. Indeed, specifically, the ratio between body mass of predators and prey, with increasing this ratio, there is an increase in food web robustness thanks to the decrease, based always on this predator-prey body mass ratio, of interaction strengths and consumption.